Hello, today we are talking about the water of life. This is focusing in on rural Zambia. Zambia is a country in Africa, and in rural Zambia, they have an extreme need for accessing water safely. Where does rural water come from? Well, a well, or a river, or a puddle. Basically, accessing and transporting water is very difficult work and impacts the lives of women and children primarily. The water that is accessed is usually very unsanitary. It can be cloudy, dirty, and in some cases can be really, really bad, full of different diseases that affect childhood growth. It's also a lot of work. That 5-gallon bucket weighs about 40 pounds when it's fully loaded, and it has to be carried sometimes as much as 3 to 5 miles to provide water to the family. This basically limits the time that children have to attend school or do other meaningful projects. Now, the rural water situation in Zambia can lead to incredible insecurity, especially during drought. During drought, these water wells or pits or puddles become holes, caves in the ground, which can easily collapse. The dryness of the soil, the lack of clays, other types of roots and trees can cause this to just completely bury people alive. Plus, if you've got a distressed water situation and you don't want to go get water because of how dangerous it is or how far you have to travel to get it, it can result in heat exhaustion, passing out on the way. There's a high mortality rate associated with the danger of water scarcity. UNICEF has labeled the water issue with the acronym WASH. That stands for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene. They track all types of social disorders associated with these three basic components, but if you can put a well in these areas, you can solve this water problem and also create sanitary and hygiene situations that don't otherwise exist. But how do you get a well in a very impoverished area? So rural Zambia the adults in this area make roughly the equivalent of $12 every month. That's much less than you would need to drill a well or buy and purchase the equipment to do that or the hardware to install it. The life expectancy of people in Zambia is roughly 60 years, and it drops significantly in the rural areas. There's just no roads, no gravel, no paved areas. You have mud trails, essentially, that can be traveled depending on the weather. There's zero electricity, so any type of infrastructure you're going to put into these areas has to survive on manual labor. And unfortunately, UNICEF doesn't even track the sanitary and hygiene measurements for these rural impoverished areas in Zambia. If you go to the Water and Sanitation and Hygiene WASH website for UNICEF, it doesn't even list Zambia on its reports, but 100 other countries. Who are we talking about exactly in Zambia? Zambians less than 18 years old make up 50% of the population. So there's massive amounts of young people in Zambia, and the population in general is 95% Christian. The first missionary contact was David Livingstone, and he helped spread the gospel in that area of the world. So if you're a rural subsistence farmer in Zambia, what's the point of being educated? If you're collecting water every single day, 7 days a week, traveling 5, sometimes even more miles to a watering hole that is dirty, do you really have time to study? And so that's one of the major issues. Without education, you're basically unemployed, and unemployment is a major factor in why you would need to be a subsistence farmer and rely on the water and not go to a city. Also, your basic food source in Zambia in these rural areas is called nishima, and it's a corn mash mixed with water, and it's eaten twice a day, and it's basically the only food a lot of these people have in these rural areas. What's the point of education in an environment that is so impoverished? There has to be some type of solution. The government does try to help. They try to make this into an issue that they can solve, but there's also large issues with bringing the government help into these rural communities, and they're mainly economic, but also there's lingual issues. There are 7 primary languages in Zambia. I'm not sure how to pronounce most of them, but one of them is Tonga. English is the official language, however, of all the law and commerce. So in order to get into the primary business of Zambia, which is in the copper exports, or to be in any type of education, you have to learn English. But once again, why would you learn or go to school in an area of Zambia where you can't even survive except for to create subsistence farming, the main staple food there? So most 60% of all these Zambians live in this rural area, and they are not employable in the copper export market, and they're just kind of overlooked by the main government. There's just no rural economy to uplift these areas. There's no reason for the government to supply these areas because there's just no the cost and the outcome is just not seen as beneficial. So to do a well, if you're going to drill a well in Zambia, you have to reach between 300 and 450 feet. Now that is extremely deep. That's a very deep well to get safe drinking water and out of the water table. And you have to get it that far because a lot of times these Zambian areas will go through a 2 to 3 year drought. So that's something that you can't control whatsoever. You just have to drill the well deep enough to get water in these drought-stricken areas. And that's usually far below what a normal manual hand pump can operate. So you have like this uncertainty of success where the government probably is not going to be the one making this happen because you'll be wasting money if you don't. Then there's what are you going to get out of it except for these rural people who don't have an economy, who can't pay you back, and you're just sinking all these funds into a situation that doesn't seem like it's going to be valuable. So it's quite a predicament. On top of that, about 1,000 people are benefited by a clean water source. That's about how many people can travel in a 5 to 6 mile area to get to clean drinking water in one of these rural zones. And the government's probably more interested in growing the economy of the cities and not in these rural areas. And unfortunately, UNICEF won't do it. Here's a quote from their website of what UNICEF does do. The key interventions supported under the programs of UNICEF include the development of WASH sector policy, strategies, plans, and standards, capacity building at the national, subnational levels. That's basically education within the government, improving sector coordination. That's just more bureaucracy, monitoring and knowledge management, more education, and sustainable and service delivery with a focus on the poor and vulnerable. So that's like public service water from the city and they just can't possibly reach out into these rural areas. This includes, among other things, routine surveillance mechanisms to monitor rates of open defecation in rural communities. So UNICEF is not interested in building wells. Building wells is extremely expensive. Getting the equipment out to these rural zones is extremely difficult because there's 0 roads. It can only be done certain times of the year. And UNICEF is not working towards this goal of actually creating wells in these zones, though it knows the hardship people suffer without having proper sanitation and proper water. So installing a pump, first you got to get a pump there. This company named Life Pump is a wonderful Christian enterprise run by 2 men, Greg Bixler and Abe Wright, who designed a completely new pump specifically for rural use cases where there's no electricity. This pump is operated by hand, and it reaches that 300 to 450 manual deep well pump necessary levels inside of the earth to bring that water up from that very, very far away water table that's below their feet. This can be operated by 2 children or by a single adult woman. So that's very important because it's usually the children and women who are fetching this water. This pump is designed for a 30-year lifespan with 0 to low maintenance. Other pumps that have done this in the past have about a 5-year lifespan before maintenance is required. And when they fail, they can leach lead into the water, which is just not acceptable. So these 2 guys, Greg Bixler and A. Wright, had designed this Life Pump. But it's not cheap. This Life Pump is made in America, and it's shipped over there. But is it worth it? If you can put a well, you can clean water well. If you can have a clean water, dependable well, it changes the entire rural economy. Suddenly, everybody goes and collects around that water source, and people who travel on the roads to these water sources become marketed people. So you could sell things to these people, and the schools and the infrastructure and the town starts to not just be all these places that are, generally seen within family structures or tribes and that kind of thing, where they're trying to separate the land based off of natural water sources, but there's a stable water source of excellent clean drinking water that's centered in a very specific population center. It's usually by a school. So if you put the water well near a school, you help ensure the efficiency of the people's labor as well as the schooling for the people who come for that water well, which is incredibly desirable. You kind of kill two birds with one stone. Plus, these children, they're going to have less disease. It's there's a study I looked up from Waddington, Brick, Cairncross in 2023. 17% of all-cause mortality in childhood is directly associated with access to clean water. That's 1 in 5 children will live. All-cause mortality. That's 1 in 5 children will live because they simply have access to clean water. That's how important it is. And you put this thing next to a school, you've just changed the community. So it's really an important thing to do. So this Matthew 7:12 project that's local to here is run by, was first envisioned by a man who came over from Zambia in one of these rural communities. His name's Bornwell Siangina. He speaks Tonga. He's lived in the United States since 1984. He's an American citizen, so he has dual citizenship. And he has a master's in business and is a well, anyway, he's the president of the nonprofit organization 712 Project, and he and other individuals on the board select areas inside of rural Zambia for these wells, strategic areas to benefit entire communities. They've already installed 3 pumps in the last 3 years, and they have goals to reach 7 more sites that are in deep need of having such a great water source. And they have almost 90% efficiency in directing all funds that they collect and all their fundraisers towards operating expenses that have gone to the pump hardware itself, the drilling fees, and because it's expensive to get a water drilling rig to travel all the way out to these rural communities where there's no roads. Remember, there's no roads and no electricity or anything like that. They have to transport the fuel and everything else out to this community in an attempt to drill a well. And also Zambian building and contractors and installers to put the pipes in for 300 some odd feet down into the ground, as well as cement for the base. So the 712 project has really headed off this need to bring water, clean water, that is necessary to make these communities thrive. It's the basis of it. Here's the references, and here's a picture of a water bottle of just typical water that you would drink all your life in Zambia. Notice how dirty it is, and it usually comes from open source ponds or holes or streams when it's not in drought. So I would ask that you would consider maybe donating or looking into how you could spread the word about the need for water in rural Zambia. Thank you for your time.